Thoris os reda Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Scott Schell and I'm a specialist in the Germanic languages. I am an independent scholar formerly associated with the University of California, Berkeley. I have a bachelor's degree in German, a master's degree in linguistics, and a PhD in Germanic linguistics. Now for this next video I wanted to go ahead and do something a little more lighthearted, right? Not so academically driven like so many of my other videos have been. And to this topic I would like to speak about Germanic versus Scandinavian and why there are some issues with those terms, specifically with Germanic. And so I thought I would go ahead and talk about two personal experiences while I was getting my PhD at UC Berkeley. So my first experience when it came to realizing that this was an issue was when I went to go talk to someone in the Scandinavian department about, what I was doing that semester. We were just kind of having a little bit of chit-chat, but he said, well, hey, what are you teaching this semester? And I said, well, I'm teaching a class on Germanic myth and religion. And you could tell the mood in the room just kind of dropped a little bit once I said Germanic myth and religion, because he kind of got this weird smile on his face, and he said, well, why not Scandinavian? What makes it Germanic, Scott? And I said, well, it's Germanic because I'm going to be using sources from Germany, sources from England, and of course sources from Scandinavia, but I'm not just teaching out of the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, for example. I'm going to also include sources like the Halion in my classroom. And he just kind of said, oh, and then changed the subject. I thought that was a little awkward, but, perhaps it was just a unique situation. Well, I continued, my studies, getting my PhD, and I eventually took this advanced Old Norse class. And a friend of mine and a colleague of mine at the time said, Scott, I heard you use that word Germanic earlier when you were talking about Odin. And I said, well, yeah, Odin is a Germanic god. And his name is attested in Old Saxon, Old English, of course Icelandic or Old Norse. And he said, well, you really shouldn't use that term. And I said, well, what's the issue? And he said, well, there are a lot of people who consider Germanic to be racist. And I was like, wow, really? I said, because I'm coming at this from purely a linguistic perspective. I'm not talking about, the sort of Nazi Germanic soul essence, sort of stuff when I use that term. So either way, I wanted to look into this a little bit more because I initially thought I was like, okay, this is a result of World War II, right? This notion of Germanic in racism. But actually, it's deeper than that. It predates World War II. It predates actually World War I. And I'm not going to talk about everything, of course, that I found, but I'm going to talk about some of these notions that started this issue of, what's Germanic versus, what's Scandinavian. So let's go ahead and go back to the 16th and 17th centuries. We have two figures. One is Johannes Burius, and then the other one is Ola Worm. Johannes Burius was a Swedish linguist and philologist, and Ola Worm was a Danish-Norwegian linguist and philologist. And what happened is that these two very prominent figures were trying to decipher runic inscriptions. And so, as you can imagine, most of the runic inscriptions in that era, where they were of the younger Futhark origin. And so they had a pretty good grasp of the younger Futhark system. But then when they started to come across these other runestones, for example, that had older features on them that they weren't quite aware of yet, they were trying to use the younger Futhark system to translate these elder Futhark inscriptions, and so it was leading to all kinds of very wild interpretations, or just, a garbled mess that they couldn't quite decipher. And that's pretty much where it started. And as far as this translation with the Futhark systems, and that was all fine until we start moving into the later years, until about the 19th century, when for example, a lot of the younger Futhark runes were still being used to translate elder Futhark inscriptions. So the Gallius horn that we know today actually the so-called z-rune, or really the so-called Nordic r-rune that I'm going to talk about in just a second, was actually understood as an m-rune. And so when they transliterated that inscription, it actually said Ek hlewgastim holtingam horna tawidog. So, as you can tell, even the r-rune and the ing-rune weren't quite differentiated yet either. But what's most important in this particular instance is that so-called Z, or that so-called Nordic R-rune, it's really a Z-rune, but we'll say so-called Nordic R, was actually interpreted as an M-rune. Now, the reason that's very significant is because if that is interpreted as an M-rune, then it's going to actually show you Old Saxon features and Old High German features. And that is essentially what allowed these German scholars to then say, this is more German than Scandinavian, right? So there's already this divide there as far as like who can lay claims to these runic inscriptions. And so there are these battles going on back and forth. And, you know, linguistic battles have always been seen between the patriots of Germany and the patriots of Scandinavia, if you will. So I wanted to go ahead and just read you a quick passage from Rasmus Rask, actually, and you know what he had to respond to. To Grimm. Grimm wrote Rask a letter, and this is Rask's response to Grimm's proposal of the word Germanic. He says to Grimm, "I cannot completely excuse Adelung and Greta for their egotistic and all too patriotic misuse of the word Germanic. It goes without saying that I, and with me every Scandinavian, will object when they consider German to be the majority member of the entire class." Funny enough, it was only in 1819 that Grimm put out his Deutsche Grammatik, so, well, there's that. But you can already see that Rask and Grimm are at odds for, are we going to call these parent languages Germanic languages, or should we call them something else, right? So one of the things I wanted to talk about as well, as far as, you know, why there's so much animosity going on back and forth, is this so-called Nordic R, and it's represented by the Elhaz rune. So, like I said before, I said, you know, even the Scandinavians were having issues with this Elhaz rune, right? They were transliterating it as M. Eventually, they came to grips with that and said, you know what, it can't be an M. It has to be some sort of what they called a soft S or a Z, similar to Gothic Z. And that's honestly where they were on the right track, right? That is what that rune sound represents. However, with all of the different politics going on in Scandinavia and in Germany, there is somebody by the name of Ludwig Wimmer who then, you know, responded with, okay, well, fine. You guys are going to actually say that the entire Jutland Peninsula was West Germanic and essentially devoid of Scandinavian runic inscriptions. I'm not going to know, you know, I'm no longer going to entertain that idea of this rune being S or Z or some sort of form of Gothic Z, but we're just going to call it Nordic R, and we're going to go from there. So basically, you know, Wimmer is saying that I'm going to ignore the fact that we have these academic arguments for it being, you know, SZ or having some sort of like trill quality, to we're just going to call it, you know, just straight Nordic R. So even to this day, inscriptions are inappropriately written as having this rune. So for example, we'll have Hlewgastis with a capital R rather than Hlewgastis with just a simple Z. But again, this is a political move. It's a political grapheme. It's a political, you know, orthographic suggestion. I mean, just take it from Stocklund here, you know, just for another example. With the R transliteration, no position is taken with regard to the question of when the transition from voiced S to the palatal R sound occurred. R is preferred only for graphemic continuity for the inscriptions, to the inscriptions of the Viking period. Even Andersen here expressly ascribes the sound value Z to this rune, but nevertheless says we're going to transliterate it as R. So why not write Z? Right? This Nordic R thing is purely political. So another thing that I would like to follow up on, which is probably a little more controversial, is this idea of proto-Scandinavian or proto-Nordic. Proto-Scandinavian or proto-Nordic never actually even existed. This was another political proposal in Scandinavia to distance itself from the word Germanic. Since we already have a proto-Germanic system, there was a sort of need, if you will, to create a proto-Scandinavian system or a proto-Nordic system. Now, before some of you go, well, hold on, this is a well-researched area. Of course we had a proto-Scandinavian system or a proto-Nordic system. A proto-language, by its very definition, means that the entire language is reconstructed. Proto-Scandinavian never existed because it's not an entire language that was reconstructed. If we're going to talk about Proto-Scandinavian, or if we're going to talk about Proto-Nordic, really what we're talking about here is Northwest Germanic, right? And this Northwest Germanic notion includes runic inscriptions like the Horn of Gallius. So there, in going back before, Northwest Germanic, before that split, we had essentially Proto-Germanic if you unite that with East Germanic. So essentially we have Proto-Germanic and then Northwest Germanic, and then you have North Germanic, which consists of the Scandinavian languages, and then you have West Germanic, which is, for example, Old English, and Old Saxon and Old High German. So there's no room really for Proto-Scandinavian to exist or Proto-Nordic to exist. And again, like I said before, a proto-language by its very definition is an entire language that's reconstructed. So if you have runic inscriptions and you're proposing reconstructions here and there, you're proposing reconstructions within the language itself that is attested. So again, I just wanted to go ahead and point that out, that on top of the so-called Nordic R and on top of the Proto-Scandinavian suggestion, even Proto-Nordic, none of those things actually even existed. So to sum up, this political back and forth between what's Germanic and what's Scandinavian has been going on for quite a long time, and the invention of Proto-Scandinavian and Proto-Nordic was really just more of a response to Proto-Germanic. So, but like I said, Proto-Germanic actually did exist in the sense that the entire language is wholly reconstructed, and it's completely unrecorded, and it is the parent stage of the family of languages as we know it, right, as far as Northwest Germanic, Germanic, West Germanic, and North Germanic. So again, I'm sure this is a little controversial for some of you, but as always, I'm more than happy to take this debate further. Go ahead and leave a comment below. Hopefully, we can actually get the ball rolling on this and just get a little bit of back and forth going on. What do you think? I mean, did Proto-Scandinavian actually exist? I mean, given, what I just said, in the video, I don't believe it can exist, but if you can convince me otherwise, go ahead and leave a comment below. Great. Well, that's all I've pretty much had for you all today. Sorry, it's a little windy out here. I thought it'd be a nice opportunity to show you the ocean here on the West Coast. So I apologize if the audio quality is not the best. Go ahead and subscribe, please. Like the video and leave any comments you have below. Thanks a lot. I'll see you soon.
Doris os reda con Eva unia agel not isen I pen elhon so tir berga